Okay, ready to go.
Great.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second in a series of our webinar series with Euromonitor International. My name is Helena Warren. I am the MD of TLN in the UK, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Caroline Bremner, who's the head of tourism and travel at Euromonitor, who will be talking us through some of the latest trends arriving from the impact of COVID-19. Following her presentation, we'll then be joined by two heads of industry within private jet and the hotel group Rosewood, who will be joining for the Q&A. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Caroline to talk us through the presentation.
Thank you, Helena. It's great to be here with you today, and I'm delighted to present Euromonitor International's latest research on the impact of COVID-19 on travel and tourism. So for today's webinar, we will, if I can move the slides forward. Here we are. Yes, for today's webinar, I'd like to discuss the scenarios that we have in terms of COVID-19, because the situation is highly unprecedented. And then we'll focus on the impact on specific categories within travel and tourism, and the various consumer shifts in behaviour and attitudes that have happened as a result of the pandemic. Then we have some trends to watch, followed by some key takeaways. And of course, we'll have the Q&A with our industry leaders at the end. So delighted to join that. So when we look at COVID-19, there has been this seismic shock in the world economy. And so companies like ourselves that monitor and collect data, we had to do a very big sort of reset and review of our understanding of the global economy. So here we've actually drawn up our latest view of global GDP, and we expect that the world economy will shrink by over 3% in 2020 as a result of the pandemic and the fact that countries have been closed, consumers have been confined in their houses, and this very short, sharp shock to economic activity. And this is also based on the duration and the state of development of the disease in terms of infection, mortality rates, and how long it will last. So our baseline understanding is that the pandemic will last for 3 quarters, but as I mentioned, it's very uncertain. So because of that, we have created some additional pandemic scenarios. So it could be that it lasts 4 quarters, it could even be 7 quarters. So this is, how we have tried to address the uncertainty that there is in the global economy. And of course, with each scenario, it becomes increasingly more pessimistic. So our worst case scenario is that C19 pessimistic 3, which is where there's a global infection rate of 50%, mortality rate of up to 3.5%, the disease lasts for 7 quarters, stock prices decline potentially by up to 70%. But I guess the good news is that this is our sort of least probable scenario. However, that sort of worst case scenario impact would be a very severe depression, in the same sort of vein as the Great Depression of the 1930s. So as I said, it's still very fluid, but we're working with these different scenarios to help understand the potential impact on economies and then of course on travel and tourism. So just with this in mind, this is what we think potentially could happen with world GDP and the global economy, with that sort of drop this year of potentially 3%, and as I mentioned, worst case scenario of about 12%. And of course, when there is this, drop in output, we expect there to be some form of recovery once things have bottomed out. And of course, there are a lot of economists debating the shape of the recovery. Our baseline is that it's a V-shaped recovery, but our worst case is that it's more of an L-shaped recovery when you look at it on a quarterly basis. And our economists put it quite nicely when they said that it's like the Nike swoosh or swish shape. So that's what we're kind of predicting overall. So the big question is, how does that economic shock then impact travel and tourism? And of course, we have been at the forefront of the restrictions, of the travel bans that began with the origins of the pandemic in China, spreading throughout Asia, then moved to Europe with the epicenter now shifting to the Americas and now in Latin America. So a truly global health crisis that has led governments around the world to take this unprecedented move to shut travel down in order to save lives. So according to the United Nations World Tourism Organization, 100% of countries have imposed some form of ban or restriction since the beginning of this year. And I was reading today that we have quarantine rules, for example, in the UK, but around the world there's 140 countries that have some form of quarantine restrictions. So for international travel and tourism, this is very challenging, of course. So how does our sort of understanding of the disease and the economic impact affect global travel and tourism? Well, here we're looking on the left there to world arrivals. And so our baseline understanding is that there will be a drop of at least 23% in global arrivals, with recovery taking sort of at least 3 years post-pandemic. But that's our best case scenario. As I mentioned, we're working with these other more pessimistic scenarios, 1, 2, and 3. And worst case, that scenario 3, is that there could potentially be a drop of 80%, and that would be based on the duration of the pandemic and the subsequent economic shock, the longer that restrictions remain in place. So, as I said, this is how we're helping our clients manage this situation that continues to evolve and develop. So we have a travel forecast model that we update quarterly, and our latest view is that there is going to be some very big disruptions this year because of the global pandemic. So when we look at total arrivals, so the leading destinations in the world, France, Spain, US, these guys have been at the top of the list for many, many years, if not decades. But now, because of the pandemic, it could be that we see that shift to Asia with countries like China rising up the ranks because they've come through the pandemic quicker than some other countries that are still going through the challenges. But that's in terms of volume. But of course, it's very important to also look at the value of incoming tourist receipts. And we're not expecting too much of a shake-up there. So the US, China, Spain, France, and Thailand will continue to be very strong generators of tourism value. When we start looking at the various impacts across different categories, to help understand, it's still very early on to say what exactly is going to happen this year. But what we did was take a view of how categories performed during previous crises. So whether that was 9/11, SARS, or the global financial crisis of 10 years ago. And then from that, we can understand the relationship between tourism demand and how different categories respond in times of crisis. So with tourism volume expected to drop by at least 20 odd percent this year, the knock-on effect on tourism receipts is going to be even harder, but it will be very much business receipts, inbound business receipts, that will be hit the most, because we tend to see business travel highly sensitive to shocks, especially economic shocks, and of course concerns by companies about sending employees abroad, and those kind of health and hygiene concerns. And so we do expect that leisure tourism to be slightly more resilient, because that's how it tends to behave in previous crises. And of course, it can be stimulated by sort of small steps, such as moving to domestic tourism and then on to intra-regional and then further on to international travel. So definitely, big drops expected for business travel. Then when we look at the varying different categories, so whether, is it what's dependent on inbound demand, such as car rentals, hotels, short-term rentals, and attractions and experiences. The hotels, we're expecting, because of the sheer scale of the crisis, to see revenue drops of at least 50 to 60%. And of course, there will be different performances, and we'll look at that in a minute. Already we're hearing that consumers are gravitating more to short-term rentals. This was already a major megatrend. People looking for authentic, local types of experiences that they felt they were getting from players like Airbnb. And post-crisis, short-term rentals offer consumers that sort of more private space, away from the crowds that you may find in the hotel foyer and things like that. And then on the sort of the categories that are dependent on outbound tourism, such as airlines, other transport, travel intermediaries, and cruise, there's going to be these very, very big sharp shocks. Every day we're hearing from the likes of IATA just the sheer scale of the state and effect of the crisis on air travel. The fact it was completely shut down pretty much in April, bottoming out, and then we're sort of coming through the worst of it, hopefully. Of course, we don't yet know if there's going to be a second wave, etc. And then, so the airlines very much at the forefront of the travel bans and restrictions. And then, of course, the intermediaries that are packaging up product, and I'm very much seeing a contraction in supply, contraction in demand, and then faced by the prospect of additional discounting and severe sort of heavy sales and offers. And of course, cruise has been at the forefront of many of the negative news headlines, with the Diamond Princess in Japan. And of course, the current concerns about these very large sort of sea vessels that where the disease has spread quite quickly amongst the passengers. And of course, there's a concern there about the sustainability element of cruise as well, where we saw the destinations in the Caribbean refusing port of entry to cruise ships. So again, it's a little bit sort of bleak, but that could just be in the short term. So here we're looking at the potential impact on hotel price platforms. So whether those hotels are mid-market, budget, or luxury, and sort of taking a view of what happened in the past crisis of 10 years ago, the global financial crisis. We expect some severe hits for the mid-market, which are obviously under pressure anyway, from the budget players, from the sort of discounting happening at the higher end. And as I mentioned, those short-term rentals, faring slightly better than those other sectors. And of course, for luxury, yes, there will be that hit, just like every other category, but over the longer term, they're more likely to recover faster because they're able to sort of tap into their loyal customers and obviously raise prices if they need to, and their clientele are able to accommodate that. So just taking a view of what happened in previous crises and what potentially could happen this time around. You know, when we had 9/11 and the global financial crisis, it took 2 years for global tourism in volume terms to recover. So we're expecting that to be slightly longer post-COVID-19 by about 3 years. Of course, that depends on the scenario that we end up with. There was no impact on domestic tourism last time around, but then, you know, this time domestic tourism has been as badly hit as inbound tourism, but it will obviously be opened up sooner as economies need to get started again. So, you know, we're seeing that as very much a playbook that, you know, within Asia or Europe, that destinations are looking to their domestic market where they can to restart economies. And then, of course, with hotels, you know, when we look 10 years ago, it took 6 years to recover to pre-crisis values. And it could be expected that it's going to take a little bit longer this time. There could even be no recovery for certain sectors that find themselves very much sort of facing long-term trends, mega trends and consumer behavioral shifts. So it could be for intermediaries, the fact that more people are booking direct means that they actually never sort of recover where they were. But again, this is it's too early to tell. And it could be that in certain regions of the world, like Asia, where intermediaries are very, very strong, very powerful with C-Trip and, you know, guys like that, you know, they are able to pull things back. And of course, online travel last time around was a major catalyst for tourism growth. However, it's a lot more mature now when you look at Expedia and Booking.com and all those people at the forefront of their industry. And it could be that, again, they've been hit as badly as everybody else, and it may take them a little bit longer to recover. And then for attractions and experiences, they'll benefit from the move to domestic tourism in the short to mid-term. And of course, consumers love, you know, the experiential, authentic engagements that they have with destinations and local cultures. So there's, you know, this will again be driven by the shift to digital as well, as that sector increasingly comes online. So as I mentioned, you know, digitalisation, the shift of, you know, online, engaging with consumers through, you know, digital platforms, etc., the booking side, that's all going to continue, and it is definitely a way to drive efficiencies and to move forward out of the crisis. Equally, what we saw was this sort of effect last time was very minimal when you look across the world. However, you know, this time around with this present crisis, as I said, digital is not an easy fix out of the crisis, but it's a tool that's a lever to, as I say, drive efficiencies on the back end, and equally have that more personalized engagement with consumers on the sort of consumer side. So just sort of to share some of the data that we have, you know, what are the key priorities for businesses? These are, you know, when we surveyed Euromonitor's clients, and it's about sort of, for travel and tourism companies over the sort of next 12 months, we ran this survey in April. There's still this continuing focus to improve the customer journey and the user experience, and to actually, you know, integrate new technologies to help deliver that. And of course, there's also this very important providing the latest information and advice to customers post-COVID-19. So there's still this strong drive to integrate things like big data, analytics, integrating artificial intelligence, driving that sort of personalized marketing, and equally using artificial intelligence on the customer service side with chatbots. And equally, I would say as well, post COVID-19, this drive as well to automate where possible and to remove human-to-human interactions so that that service becomes a lot more contactless, touch-free, and of course, by association, much safer. And that frees up, human interactions to be a lot more considered and thoughtful, and of course, higher quality as well. So let's now sort of shift gears slightly and look at some of the consumer behavior and attitude shifts that we've seen from recent survey data that we have at Euromonitor. So this is from our April survey, where we went out, because obviously with COVID-19 being declared mid-March, there was this global shutdown. So we had to go back out and talk to our clients and consumers about the changes that they're seeing by their customers. And so what's interesting is looking at the changes in the short and midterm compared to what is expected to be a permanent shift. So of course, in the immediacy of the pandemic, consumers reined in their spending. They basically stopped sort of leaving the home. They were sort of confined, and there was the social lockdown. And of course, there was that sort of dramatic shift from online shopping to from offline shopping to online shopping. And of course, this concern about buying health and wellness related products. And what we're expecting in the long term is this permanent shift to online shopping. So, even across all different age groups have really embraced online shopping, and this is expected to remain after the pandemic subsides. Very importantly, changes in travel behavior. There was a big shift away from public transport, using personal cars more to avoid public spaces. And of course, again, this big move away from using sort of planes and taking flights and international travel. That's, in the short to mid-term. But what we're also seeing long term is that there is this expectation that they will return to international travel. So, there's a lot of people just sort of putting things on hold, waiting till things settle down. Once the restrictions, the quarantine rules are, relaxed and removed, that they can then sort of get back, and start traveling again. So in the short to mid-term, this sort of holidaying closer to home, domestic trips, sort of visiting friends and family. We've also seen the opening up of the travel corridors, those sort of air bridges that they're creating to help sort of these kind of baby steps to opening up. Some of the long-term shifts and changes or concerns that we saw from consumers are continuing. So every year we ask, how concerned are you about climate change? And what we've seen every single year, more and more people are concerned about it. And currently, like 64% of the global consumers that we speak to, so that's a survey with like 40,000 people, say that they are worried about climate change. And equally, there's a very high level of people who want to have a positive impact on the environment. And yes, there is a sense at the moment with the pandemic that the focus has moved to health and hygiene. But, over the long term, we expect this continued interest in the climate emergency and having that positive impact, and equally, respecting brands that put people and purpose and, the planet above profit. So these are all shifts that we're seeing at Euromonitor. And I pulled some sort of information together on experiences and sustainability. So we do see, as I mentioned, this sort of very strong interest in having a positive impact, and that was across all generations, particularly in the sort of millennials and the baby boomers. Equally, the sense of consumers valuing real life experiences. There is a concern that post-pandemic that they shy away, they're cautious, and they're afraid, and there's that fear factor of enjoying the real world and moving more to the virtual world. Well, what we see is that there's still this very strong continued interest in real life experiences, but also an interest as well in virtual experiences, particularly by the younger age groups, Gen Z and the millennials. Also, we have some information on the penetration of ecotourism in terms of travel preferences. And it's unfortunately, it looks quite low, but what we do see is that the proportion of millennials and Generation Z, there's a higher proportion of them that have an interest, an affinity for sustainable ecotourism. So just to say, consumers, they're still very experiential, and particularly the younger consumers who show this interest as well in sustainable experiences. Also, as part of our COVID-19 survey in April, we sort of looked at these sustainability issues. Are consumers reducing their carbon emissions over the short to mid-term? And of course, they are, because they're reducing their international travel. But what was very interesting here was this permanent shift to the importance that consumers paid to brands and companies that put people, like their customers, their employees and staff, first. So, for example, when we look at BrewDog or LVMH, who turned their manufacturing to making hand sanitizers, or fashion brands like Burberry making masks, or whatever it is. So these companies that actually sort of helped through the pandemic, during the crisis, we expect to be well positioned once things return to this new normal that we're all hoping for. Okay, so now I'm just going to run through some interesting trends that we've picked up on. As I mentioned, this is sort of bearing in mind the current situation. And of course, with the global shutdown, we've seen this very strong interest by consumers to engage in immersive travel experiences. And there's been much talk over the years about, will virtual travel overtake real travel? And of course, in April, it did seem like it had, but it's not necessarily going to be permanent. So this is where we have the Faroe Islands with their fun and engaging interaction, where consumers can actually remote control a local guide, and that guide on the destination in the Faroe Islands explores, and you can see what she's looking at, and you can make her run and jump. And it's just a great way of engaging and interacting with potential future visitors. And of course, this sort of sense of brands with purpose, which we've talked about. Marriott, the sort of luxury hotel chain, they saw occupancy rates of sort of 10%, so big drops of 90% in April. A quarter of the hotels around the world closed. But in India, what they did was repurpose their kitchen. So they created Marriott on Wheels so that they could serve food to the local communities. So again, companies that have stepped up, looked to how they can help their local communities and look after people during the pandemic. This is a really great example of brands with purpose. donating, to healthcare professionals, donating rooms, providing equipment, and of course with hospitality being a highly human interaction and a human sort of experience, we expect that brands that, as I say, embody this sort of sense of humanity and purpose are going to really resonate with consumers in the short and long term. This is a really interesting example in the Arctic Circle. It is a climate positive hotel called Svart, and it will be opening up in 2022. It's the first powerhouse hotel in the Arctic, and it uses cutting edge technology. It's got this fantastic circular design. It embraces the circular economy principles of reducing its impact on the environment, having the very sort of sensitively built structure, and also the fact that they're going to be using less energy, or actually giving back more energy to the local environment than they use over the next 60 years. So a very interesting example about the next gen sort of architecture that's coming in, and how, one, very stunning and very thoughtful and considerate to the local community and environment. We have the Red Sea Development Project in Saudi Arabia. This is a really fascinating example of where technology is being deployed to really drive sustainability. And so this resort is going to cover 90 islands. It's going to have 14 luxury hotels, but sustainability is very much at its heart. And as I said, they're going to be using artificial intelligence, the Internet of Things, the fact that they're going to be using biometrics, all to deliver very personalized and sustainable experiences to their guests, and use that technology to also protect the local environment. And I really like the fact that they're going to be providing their guests with personal carbon trackers, which sounds, this could become a standard for the industry. Equally, we have here sort of Uber Air, which is, the sort of Uber moving into the skies, taking its sort of ride-hailing principle and applying it to air travel. And it's sort of this next generation of urban mobility using these electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft that will be very sort of short point to point, and they'll sort of go city to suburb or city to city. And the fact that they're electric means that, there's sort of zero impact on the environment, or very minimal impact on the environment. And it's really interesting that they have already started these tests in cities like Dallas and Melbourne. And, potentially we could see all these skyports popping up, taking people these very short distances in sort of zero carbon aircraft. And of course, in the travel industry, we have these brands of purpose, such as Intrepid, that have embraced sustainability since their inception, and the fact that they have, their B Corp, so everything is measured and tracked in terms of their impact on the environment and society, and of course communities. And just this really very, sort of resonating quote: if we don't act now, there will be no travel in the decades and centuries to come. And of course, we didn't have any travel in April, really. And we do have this once in a lifetime opportunity to build back better, and to really embrace those mega trends in terms of sustainability, purpose, and, putting experiences and, people-centric experiences at the heart of the recovery. So when it comes to some of these long-term trends, that we expect to lead the industry out of the crisis, these sort of adventure wellness types of activity are sort of, they're in smaller groups, they have more minimal impact on the environment, that shift to sustainable experiences that we talked about, and of course in the short term this real desire by consumers to get back to nature once they're released from their houses. And of course Gen Z and Gen Y, they're not necessarily going to sort of lead us out of the recovery, but there could be this pent-up demand from younger generations that have been least or less impacted by the sad, infection rates that we've seen, particularly in the higher age groups. And of course, digitalisation is a must. It really is, in terms of customer experience, in terms of the back end, in terms of booking. That's what one of the key tools to drive efficiencies and help with recovery. And of course, we've got this once in a lifetime opportunity to say, these are the unsustainable business models that really we have to not take with us. I think because they're unsustainable, they don't help the environment, they don't help communities, and we have to question some of the principles and behaviours that we saw of mass tourism, and how do we reset, rebalance, and move forward with the best of travel and tourism and what it can offer. And of course, in the short term, we also have the fact that MICE travel is completely, off the cards just now. We're all sort of Zooming and conducting these types of experiences online. So big question mark over the future of MICE, but I'm sure it will come back in some form, embracing virtual and the physical. And of course, baby boomers will need a sort of a lot more reassurance and very sort of considered communication to help reassure them that it's great and it's fine to go back and explore the world again. Of course, some will be more brave than others. So just to summarize before we go into the Q&A, when we look at travel in the new normal, there is this sense that, one, it's highly uncertain what's going to happen because we don't know everything about this disease. There could be future waves, and obviously we have to be prepared for that. So there is this sort of gradual, very tentative opening up that we're seeing, and the creation of these travel corridors and bubbles, the importance of looking at the development of the disease and how we then sort of work with that to open up travel. So going from zero travel to very localized, hyper-local travel, visiting friends and relatives, domestic, being the sort of port of call first, and then sort of moving out to intra-regional, and then sort of long-haul international. And of course, we have this sort of the importance of making sure that we have our health priorities, and then these will gradually move to, okay, what about this sheer economic impact that or recession that's coming down the line, and the importance of making sure that the recovery embraces those SDGs and the global agenda for 2030. And of course, the new normal in the immediate term is that fear factor, integrating health and hygiene protocols, the importance of social distancing, and there's some big questions about how to do that across hotels and airlines and cruise. So some big challenges ahead, but of course we have to put health and safety at the forefront, along with that long-term sustainable agenda. So without a doubt, just to summarize, COVID-19 is having an unprecedented effect and impact on consumers, on economies, how people live their life, how they work, how they shop, how they travel. It's changing behaviors. Some trends that we saw pre-COVID-19 have been completely accelerated, such as digitalisation, such as the importance of looking after communities and sustainability. And of course, for destinations and brands, it's going to be a challenge to, we have to work extra hard to reassure visitors that it is safe to get on that plane, that they will be looked after, that they do have the, the terms and conditions of the contract or the package or whatever they're choosing will, look after them if the worst case happens. And of course, we have the fact that digitalisation and automation can improve and remove some of those unnecessary interactions, so that we will see us moving to a more seamless, touch-free customer journey, equally more personalized, because we will have to also understand people's health and, is it safe for them to travel or not? So, there's that sort of integrating technology, that sort of track and trace kind of approach, but equally using it throughout the travel ecosystem to keep people safe. And of course, there's this once in a lifetime opportunity to take advantage of the pause that we have right now to, build back better, putting communities and people at the heart of the recovery, and making sure that they're taken with us when we go on this journey of recovery, and hopefully, people going back to some form of normality, whatever that is. And of course, we have that global agenda, the 17 sustainable development goals, and we do have to sort of not lose sight of that, and work hard to minimize the negative impacts of travel, and make sure that we reset in the best and most resilient way, so that we can achieve those, and and also encourage people to keep traveling in a sensible and sustainable and enjoyable way, because ultimately that's what travel is all about. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for listening today, and looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Caroline. That was fascinating insights from your side. If everyone listening could think perhaps of a question that they might want to ask Caroline and the rest of the panel, and just pop that in the Q&A, we can ask those shortly. I'd just like to bring into the conversation now two panelists. Firstly, Mike Bonner, who's the Head of Sales and Marketing at Rosewood, London. And secondly, Christoper Williams-Martin, who's the CEO of Fly Elite Jets. Welcome. I'm not sure.
Good morning, Helena.
Good morning.
Good morning, everyone.
Just to sort of mirror what Caroline mentioned there, I can see there's perhaps 4 trends that have emerged in her sort of commentary. One would be digital, second would be experiences, health and wellness would be a third, and sustainability and climate change would be a fourth. I wonder first, if we turn to Mike, in the hotel industry, perhaps you could shed some insight from your experience of COVID, how those trends have been playing out.
Yeah, I mean, the focus from our point of view, we obviously went into this situation with everybody else. We closed the hotel on the 22nd of March, and our focus really during
I think you've slightly frozen there. Perhaps we can come back to
local
Mike.
Community. Now, we've always had a close around the hotel in Holborn during this process, rather than undertake any.
I think we lost you for a minute there, Mike. Sorry, I think the internet connection went a bit there.
Back, so I was been playing up this morning.
Do you mind just repeating that for everybody?
Yeah, so I was saying during this period, we've focused on the local community. We've always been tried to be a good neighbour and a good a key player in the local community around the hotel, but we've really just amplified that during this process. So we've undertaken a number of initiatives to support the NHS. So we've had over the course of the past 2 months, we've been providing food and snacks and amenities initially to Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is just around the corner from the hotel, to the staff and nurses who are still operating Great Ormond Street on a weekly basis. And then latterly we included also Royal Marsden Hospital. So we've had some of our chefs going into the hotel, appropriately socially distancing in the kitchens and employing all the health and safety standards that are required, and then delivering those food parcels to the hotel along with the packs as well. We've had a number of other initiatives, magazine and Bride Lux, the wedding. So I think about 8 nations for people who were NHS workers, who were genuine NHS workers, were allowed to apply. And we're working with 20 partners to provide a complimentary wedding to a couple later in the year when weddings will be allowed for up to 150 guests at such points when that is allowed. So it's really about engaging with the local community and just putting that message out there. And so until such time when we're ready to open, which will be in September or something.
Okay, thank you, Mike. And Christoper, welcome.
Hi, Helena.
Hi, Christoper, as I mentioned, is CEO of Fly Elite Jets. So obviously the upper scale end of the airline industry. So perhaps, again, you could talk to those perhaps 4 trends and how they're sort of influencing your business.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've sort of were at the sharp end of it. We noticed an immediate demand for evacuation flights from the 13th of February. And that was the first sort of panic wave and gave us an idea of the scale of this. We knew immediately, of course, that our usual VIP clients wouldn't be flying. The evacuation flights ran until the end of the first week of March. And since then, we've shifted the business slightly to using aircraft to fly medical equipment to key customers. It's a slightly moral dilemma for me because I don't really like the idea of being involved in projects where people are going to make lots of money out of supplying potentially life-saving equipment to hospitals and etc. But I see it as a service, and as long as everyone's working ethically, then fine, great. We're part of the solution, not part of the problem. We've noticed that in the last week, there's been an increasing demand from clients who are desperate to get away with their families and have a much deserved holiday. So there's we're just at the start of that, but how it actually works in practical use, it's a completely different travel experience. As Caroline mentioned, it's very much a touchless, seamless journey. So frankly, the VIP terminals are redundant, really. No one wants to go anywhere near those. There's no shaking hands. You're on board with a face mask. The crew stay away from you, and it's a self-service system. So that helps to safeguard families. So and we're at the start of that. So it's a new experience, and we'll see what happens.
Okay, thank you very much. I've had several Q&As come in, so if I perhaps start and ask these. Question from Sophia in relation to Uber Air. How will the changes, perhaps this is one for you, Caroline, apply for Uber Air? Will such a service be affordable?
That's a great question. I think if you look at Uber and what they've done disrupting urban mobility around the world, I think it is going to be available. But what we'll probably see is that it will be sort of high-end corporate market to begin with. But then as they build the infrastructure, that it will become more available. So it become sort of part of the urban transit. So yeah. I would imagine it will start higher end, but then become more mass.
Great. Okay, thank you. Another question from Benjamin. He asks, can the high-end luxury market drive the development of more sustainable community-based tourism, or will this segment remain exclusive and separate?
I think that luxury is in a very strong position to really drive this trend. And I know, we've been looking at luxury travel for many years with my colleague Fleur and our team. So, sustainability is part and parcel of the luxury offer. And I think it's now to really sort of double down on that, because it's also, it's, as I mentioned, we're seeing this shift away from not just sustainability about the planet and this sort of mass movement against plastics. It's also about brands with purpose. So as Mike was mentioning there, working with the community, helping out during crisis, and also, making sure that that's integral to the ethos of the brand. So, for me, it goes hand in hand with luxury, and you could really make a massive difference to the communities that you work with, not just in terms of, employment, but equally sort of making sure that these initiatives are, encouraging women into education, girls into education, and all these pivotal drivers that will help boost income and equality. And yeah, it's looking at, there's 17 sustainable development goals and just making that as part of your roadmap. That would be a quite good exercise to do. I hear lots of new startups taking that sustainability agenda, and that's built into the fabric of what they do from the get-go. So everything they do is with that mindset.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that sort of in mind, there's a couple of questions here about the idea of medical tourism. So especially as health is now a centre of this the COVID obviously pandemic. What are your thoughts? I guess again, Christoper touched on it in terms of the emergency medical flights and the aid flights he's doing. But is there a trend in that space as well, would you say, Caroline?
I would say that, medical tourism is quite niche. We have data on medical tourism, but what we find is that it's, as I say, a component. Say, if you look at South Korea, it's got a really strong medical tourism offer, but has done for many years. It feels that, if you were a destination and you were suddenly to pivot towards medical tourism, I wouldn't sort of advise that, because you really have to have, the infrastructure, the facilities there to begin with. And it feels more like it should be broader, and it should be more about well-being. And, we know that we're moving into a much more holistic sense of well-being. Post-COVID, consumers, yes, want to have, to be safe, and to be healthy. But equally, I think it's more holistic than that. And that's what we're seeing. It's about your personal impact. They want to, to do the best and have the least impact on the environment and the communities. It feels more holistic in terms of what we should be focusing on, not just medical tourism. But of course, if anybody would like, to have a more detailed call and look at some of the data on medical tourism, we could arrange that afterwards.
That's fantastic, thank you. A question here for Christoper, and I think I know the answer to it, but I'll let you respond. A question about your pricing, about whether or not you charge the same for your private clients as you would do for the medical supplies that you're transporting.
So the two services are very different. Obviously, a VIP flight involves a number of key elements, including chauffeured limousines, onboard service, etc. Flying the medical equipment is a completely different ball game. It's essentially cargo, albeit high value cargo, and there's certain rules and regs we have to follow with that. So it's a very highly regulated form of flying. There's also permits. There's both from the export country and into the import country. And if you have to stop over en route in any particular country, there's paperwork for that. So it's very paperwork heavy in terms of flying. But in terms of the pricing, it's big jets, big cargo jets. So, to be quite frank, the owners of the cargo aircraft, they know they're onto a good one right now. So they're making big money. That's beyond our control. We're not a cargo airline, but we are providing cargo aircraft on lease for clients. Okay. So it's boom time for the cargo aircraft operators right now.
Thank you. Okay. Another question around planning for travel, and whether, in terms of travel in October, whether you anticipate people will be going more locally or abroad. I mean, we talked about a 3-year recovery there, Caroline, but in terms of actually planning ahead, I guess people are kind of thinking, when can we get on with a holiday, perhaps later in the year? Do you think October is a good sort of benchmark for that, or do you see that trend sort of lasting into next year?
It depends. I've seen lots of different surveys about consumer sentiment. Mm-hmm. And so when you look at the States, sort of American travelers are looking to get on the road sooner than maybe we're thinking in Europe. So I guess it's about sort of undertaking these types of consumer sentiment surveys and keeping an eye on, how are consumers feeling. And of course, every country is in a different stage. So it really depends on your key source markets. It does sound like, the majority of people will be looking towards the sort of the Q4 of this year. And definitely there is a sense that, by mid next year, that the disease will have, hopefully have run its course. So I know that it's a very, very bleak time for the travel industry, but, mm-hmm. Keeping an eye on that sentiment is one way to, stay ahead of these trends. And also it's a great opportunity just to be engaging with customers and consumers and finding out, well, what are they concerned about? And can you sort of pivot? So for example, like Airbnb experiences pivoting to virtual, that allows those hosts, experienced hosts, to make some revenue, even if it's not what they would have been making. So just also sort of, where can we pivot? How can we diversify? What do we do in this sort of interim until there's some form of fuller opening up?
Okay, thank you. And Mike Bonner, I had a question here about the hotel industry and how you're anticipating perhaps doing something more virtually, and how you're going to bring, I know you have the Rosewood journeys as one of your brand messages. Is that something you're pushing out in your marketing plan in the view to sort of open in sort of September?
Yeah, I mean, as a brand globally, we currently have 17. Well, we closed 17 of our hotels globally. We're closed. We've got 6 reopening in the next few weeks. For London, we've decided to open in September, in part to push us past this quarantine period, which could potentially quite a big impact on our industry. And in the meantime, we're looking at how we've engaged with our customers and our clients. So part of that program, we decided on a fairly kind of low touch marketing program. So Journeys in Place, which is basically talks about the experiences that you can have at Rosewood and in the destinations globally where we are, and to try and inspire people and just to remind people of the beauty of travel and staying in lovely destinations and hotels until such time when all our hotels are back and operating. In addition to that, so we haven't been doing aggressive marketing campaigns or anything like that. We've just been a little bit of social media around what I was talking about earlier, the community campaigns, and just light contact with our travel agent partners. And we hope that by the time we come back in September, that there will be a demand to travel. As Caroline was saying, we expect the initial demand to be hyper-local, local businesses, local community coming back, moving to more kind of domestic, and then out to short haul destinations, so travel from Europe, and then latterly the long haul destinations coming back, Asia and Asia probably looking like it's going to start to move first, and then latterly the US. So it's just about just keeping engaged and providing inspiring content to inspire people for when they are ready to travel, and if people will be willing to travel, and at some point in the future.
Yeah, and just another question that's just come in while you were speaking, about the competition between obviously your hotel brand and other sort of Airbnbs or similar high-end luxury private owned accommodation. I mean, do you see that there's going to be a shift in that space because of this, or is it just a general competition that is existing?
I think there could be. I mean, people are going to be looking to know that they are going to be looked after when they get to their destination, and whether they're staying in a hotel or a villa or an Airbnb. And I think the advantage, with an Airbnb, they're not directly in control necessarily of the standards at the end property. And there's very high-end properties, and they do very well. But in this new world environment, the consumer is going to want to know what the standards are. And whilst we've been closed, the team, some of my colleagues were working, the biggest question we're getting asked at the moment are, what are those health and safety protocols going to be when we open? How am I going to be looked after? My guests, if it's a travel agent or a corporate booker, how are we going to look after those guests? And it's a bit easier for a hotel to control those standards, and to know exactly what we're going to do to make sure that we look after guests. Yeah.
Okay, that makes total sense. All right, fantastic. Well, I think that's all of the questions that we've got come through. Just want to say a big thank you to Caroline. Fantastic insights there. And obviously to yourself, Mike and Christoper. Really enjoyed speaking to you this morning. For everyone else that joined, this will be on the YouTube channel for the Luxury Network. And we also have obviously the contacts of the panelists if anyone would like to contact after the webinar. So thank you again, and look forward to the next webinar in a couple of weeks' time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.